Alright, it's time to talk about the transatlantic trade system and its multitudinous effects. And if you're anything like me, well, that sounds like a party. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now if you'll recall in the last video, we talked about the development of the British colonies in the Americas and how in the beginning it was pretty rough for all involved, including but not limited to resorting to cannibalism in order to survive. Is this Jerry? This tastes like Jerry. But later into the 17th century, nobody was eating anyone else anymore because most of the colonists had figured out how to survive and thrive economically. And for that, they could thank the growth of the transatlantic trade, or trade across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if you've ever found yourself in a casual lunchroom conversation about 17th century transatlantic trade, and let's be honest, who hasn't found themselves in that delectable situation, then you probably have heard about the triangular trade. Now, these trade routes roughly formed a triangle, and they're a good illustration of the way maritime trade bound states together economically across the vast stinking ocean. So one way the cycle of trade worked was that New Englanders shipped rum to West Africa, and then that rum was traded for enslaved laborers, and then those laborers were shipped across the Middle Passage to be traded for sugarcane in the West Indies. And that sugarcane got shipped right up to New England where it could be distilled into rum, and around the triangle we go again. And I'm not as concerned that you remember all the goods that were traded, although it probably wouldn't hurt you to find an empty brain fold and stuff it in there. I'm more concerned that you understand how dependent each economy had become on goods from the other economies. I mean, that rum isn't getting made without sugarcane, and that sugarcane isn't getting grown without enslaved labor, and those enslaved laborers aren't getting purchased without some rum in the slave trader's tum. You smelling what I'm stepping in here? I hope so, because as the system grew more and more profitable, it fundamentally shaped the nature of colonial economies. And I'm not talking only about the triangular trade now, but all the various economic dependencies that developed via trade routes. And there are two major effects of that you should know. First, the main priority of colonial economies was to produce goods that were in high demand along the trade routes, and in some cases to focus nearly their entire economy on the production of high demand commodities. And speaking of high demand commodities, I reckon you're itching for an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And if that's you might want to check out my APUSH Heimler review guide, which is the fastest and most complete way to study. It's got exclusive unit review videos that are not here on YouTube. It's got practice questions, practice exams, and note guides to follow along. It's also got answer keys for every dang bit of it, so get that clicky finger out and check the link in the description. Anyway, probably the best example of colonial economies shaped by high demand commodities is the production of sugarcane in the British West Indies. Now, it was Christopher Columbus himself that introduced sugarcane to the Caribbean, and once it was discovered that the good soil and warm climate could facilitate long growing seasons, sugar cultivation began to dominate colonial economies in places like Barbados and Jamaica. And once Europeans got more and more access to sugar, the demand for it went hog wild. And it's not hard to understand why. You drinking nasty black coffee? Sweet yourself. You taking medicine that tastes like an old monkey's armpit? Sweet yourself. There were so many nasty tasting things that could be made tasty with only a little bit of sugar. And so as demand for sugar increased, the economies of those sugar producing islands became almost entirely devoted to its production. And so the second and related effect of this demand for sugar was a massive increase in the demand for enslaved laborers to do the intensive work of planting and harvesting. In large part, this demand was satisfied by enslaved Africans, but often overlooked was the large-scale enslavement of American Indians to provide labor as well. And because the working conditions were so harsh and unforgiving, many laborers died, and that only further increased the demand for enslaved labor. And so again, you can begin to see the tight web of economic interdependence being woven between the various states across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, now you didn't think all this transatlantic economic interdependence happened without an economic ideology that dictated the terms of its expansion, did you? Don't be crazy. No, it was in fact the economic system known as mercantilism that created the conditions for everything I've been talking about. Now, by definition, mercantilism was an economic system that emphasized a favorable balance of trade, which is to say greater exports than imports. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, then as I am wont to do, allow me to compare mercantilism to a pie, and I think that's going to help you understand how it all fits together. So a pie, as you know, only has so much pie, and you can only slice it into so many pieces. And if one person wants a bigger slice of that pie, then that means that other people are going to get less. And to put it mildly, European economies during this period loved them some pie. So mercantilist states measured their own wealth in terms of gold and silver. That was their pie. And so there was only so much gold and silver in the world, and so their goal was to get as big a piece of that pie as they could. So that's why mercantilist states wanted to export more goods than they imported, because when they export, gold comes in, but when they import, gold goes out. Now, I know we're all having a blast talking about mercantilism in its theoretical form, but here's why it's important. In the mercantilist system, the whole purpose of establishing colonies was to enrich the mother state. In other words, the whole job of the colony was to help Big Mama get some more pie. And that's where we start running into problems with Big Mama Britain and her American colonies. Now, remember that I mentioned in a previous video that Britain's American colonies developed systems that allowed them to operate somewhat independently of Great Britain proper. And that was kind of a necessity owing to this big honking ocean that separated liberated them. But there came a time when Great Britain, that sassy mercantilist state, attempted to clamp down on those American colonies and force them to serve the imperial economy. And perhaps the most notorious example of this effort came in the form of the Navigation Acts, which basically imposed 3 rules. First, any goods that the colonists imported had to first pass through ports in England in order to be taxed. Second, any goods that colonists traded had to be transported on English ships. And third, the British produced a list of highly valuable colonial goods that could only be exported to England. So this legislation had the effect of stripping the American colonists of their autonomy and making economic decisions that best served them. Instead, their economies were now made to serve Great Britain alone, and that was a bad deal for those colonists who had been used to acting independently. However, it wasn't long before the colonists remembered that big honking ocean separating them from Great Britain, and they soon found that in a lot of cases they could ignore the Navigation Acts without punishment, and this is what we call salutary neglect. And to be clear, salutary neglect wasn't like a formal policy or anything. It just kind of happened on account of Great Britain being distracted by other more pressing issues elsewhere and therefore did not enforce their colonial laws consistently. But that neglect was somewhat intermittent, and so there were times when Britain worked harder to control its American colonies by removing their autonomy. For example, starting in 1686, King James II created the Dominion of New England, which was a kind of super colony that combined all these colonies up here. And in this super colony, the king appointed a governor who didn't have to answer to the colonial elected assemblies, and that governor in turn appointed local officials to replace elected officials. Now, this arrangement, of course, made it much easier for the crown to have tighter control over colonial policies and trade enforcement. However, in 1688, an event known as the Glorious Revolution occurred in England, in which Parliament overthrew King James and re-established their own governmental power. And in doing so, they installed new monarchs, William and Mary, who agreed to rule in accordance with the increased power of Parliament. And when news of that revolution reached the American colonies, rebellions broke out, the most significant effect of which was the collapse of the Dominion of New England and the return of elected colonial assemblies. Okay, now most of what I've been focusing on here is European trade with their colonial empires. However, let's not forget that colonial people were still trading with various American Indian groups as well, and that had 3 significant effects you're going to need to remember. First, colonists introduced European goods to indigenous people, most notably metal tools and firearms and horses. And for those indigenous groups that received guns, for example, the power dynamics between them and rival indigenous groups shifted significantly in the favor of those with the boomsticks. Second, trade with American Indians led to the spread of epidemic diseases like smallpox and measles, which, as we covered in previous videos, led to devastation among indigenous populations. And third, as indigenous people grew more and more dependent on European goods, they became more vulnerable to manipulation and internal division. Now, a good example of the interaction between Great Britain's mercantilist policies and conflicts with American Indians is Bacon's Rebellion. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this in another video, namely about the relationship between this rebellion and the transition to reliance on African slavery in the colonies. But for now, all you really need to know is that a group of poor and disenfranchised indentured servants began attacking American Indian groups on the frontier of Virginia, at least one of which was an ally of the British. The rebels then turned to attack the governor, William Berkeley, who fled from his attackers. However, Berkeley was able to secure reinforcements from the British Navy and eventually put down the rebellion. Now, afterward, the colony came under much more direct control of the crown for a time, because if a colony is busy suppressing rebellions, then they're not exporting tobacco and serving their purpose in the larger mercantilist party of the empire. But after the Glorious Revolution and the mounting expenses of continually getting involved with managing colonial disputes, Parliament began to loosen its grip on some of those policies that aimed to tighten control over their colony. And so, conflicts like this with American Indians sometimes led to efforts to tighten control, and sometimes control was loosened, either because of cost or commitments to other, more pressing matters. The point is, enforcement of these mercantilist policies was erratic. Okay, you can click here to watch my other videos covering Unit 2, and you can click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, which will help you study as fast as possible. And I appreciate you coming around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.